In the years since the end of the Second World War, major shifts in international boundaries have been both rare and significant occurrences. Territorial integrity and the inviolability of borders are almost sacrosanct, backed by international treaties and organizations to ensure their protection. But this is a relatively recent development. Prior to the Cold War, and even in its very early years, annexations and land transfers and seizures were more generally tolerated, even if they could be publicly condemned. 1945 saw a widespread redrawing of the map, with much of the change happening in Eastern and Central Europe. I'm your host David, and today we are going to look at one specific territorial annexation on the shores of the Baltic Sea, Konigsberg, the present-day exclave of Kaliningrad. This is the Cold War. Now, if you're interested in Japanese snacks, you don't need an exclave in Japan. You need to subscribe to the sponsor of this video, Boxu. Boxu is a monthly snack box subscription service that delivers original assortments of premium Japanese snacks and tea pairings right to your door. Every month, you'll receive a box with a different theme. The snacks will always be different, so it becomes a new gourmet journey through Japan every month. This month's box celebrates the Otsukimi Moon Festival, which has been celebrated since the Heian period, with people gathering to honor the beauty of the harvest moon. We couldn't decide which was our favorite snack, the Funwari Meijin Mochi Puffs or the chocolate Azuki beans. The box is shipped straight from Japan and comes straight to you. Order now and use our code COLDWAR20 to get 10% off your first authentic Japanese snack box from Boxu. That is up to $47 off. Take advantage of this limited time offer. To start this story, we need to go back in time to 1255, if only briefly. This was the year the city of Konigsberg was founded by Teutonic Knights on their Northern Crusade. Some of the more particular of you will be shouting at your screens that Konigsberg was predated by a Sambian outpost named Twangsta, but 1255 is when it was taken by the Teutonic Order and renamed Konigsberg. Over the following almost 700-year period, Konigsberg lived a rich and vibrant history, rising to be a center of Prussian spiritual life and heritage, as well as a major commercial hub in the eastern Baltic region. It's a fascinating history, but well outside the scope of this channel, so moving on. Following the defeat of the Central Powers in 1918, the map of Europe was redrawn, with Poland and Lithuania gaining independence and being given portions of territory that had been part of East Prussia. Konigsberg found itself the capital of a German exclave separated from the rest of the country by the Danzig corridor. During the war years, Konigsberg was relatively untouched, protected by its distance from air bases in the west and the small size of Soviet long-range aviation. All of this changed, however, at the end of August 1944, when the Royal Air Force carried out a series of bombing raids on the city. The combination of high explosive and incendiary bombs which were dropped resulted in the destruction of up to 20% of industrial capacity in the city, as well as 41% of all houses. The historic city center was heavily damaged and included the gutting of the Konigsberg Cathedral. In January of 1945, as the Soviet Union launched their East Prussian offensive, the city found itself surrounded by the Red Army and coming under intense bombardment. Despite the city finding itself hundreds of kilometers behind the front line, cut off from the remaining German war machine, it was decided to launch an offensive to capture the city and remove the threat posed by the up to 130,000 German troops in the city and the surrounding pocket. The assault, which lasted from April 6th to the 9th, was considered a tremendous success for the Red Army, capturing up to 80,000 Germans, of which maybe 40% were civilians. The city itself was in ruins, with estimates that up to 80% of the city had been destroyed. We'll come back to what happened after the occupation of the city, but first, we need to outline what the anti-Nazi coalition had already planned for East Prussia and Konigsberg. As early as the 1943 Tehran Conference, Stalin had been demanding that Konigsberg and East Prussia become a part of the Soviet Union when the war was done. And the motivations for this? Well, there were two primary ones. The first was one that went back into the murky mists of time. Russia, now the Soviet Union, and its desire for a port city that was ice-free year-round. The Soviet Union lacked this on the Baltic Sea, but control of East Prussia, including Konigsberg, would resolve this strategic shortcoming. The second motivation for the Soviet desire to annex East Prussia was a symbolic one, but no less important. The territory was recognized as the cradle of German militarism and had been instrumental in the rise of both the German Empire as well as the Third Reich. The conquest and annexation of this Junker heartland, long the Western adversary of Russia, would be a deep blow to the military and imperial traditions of Germany. And how were Stalin's demands greeted by the other powers at Tehran? Well, both Churchill and Roosevelt agreed with the mustache and accepted that the territorial transfer would happen at war's end. They recognized the position the region held in the minds of militaristic Germans and were interested in both weakening and shrinking German power and territory. The Potsdam Conference in July of 1945 affirmed Konigsberg, and approximately one-third of East Prussia was to become a part of the Soviet Union, while the remaining two-thirds was given to Poland. This was made official on October 17, 1946, as the border between Poland and the USSR was officially finalized. Along with this came a change of name. After all, Konigsberg was a name rooted in the history of the now defeated enemy. A number of variants were proposed: Slavogorod, Gorodloviec, and what was seen as the frontrunner, Baltisk. But then, in June of 1946, the chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR died. Mikhail Kalinin had joined the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party the year it was founded in 1898, even before it had split into the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks. As a so-called Old Bolshevik, his death changed the naming situation, and Konigsberg was renamed after Kalinin, Kaliningrad, a name that the city continues to hold to this day. Along with the city name being changed also came new street names. Goethestrasse became Ulica Pushkina, Mozartstrasse became Ulica Repina, and Straussstrasse became Ulica Rimskovo-Korsakova. Now, back to the citizenry. On April 9, 1945, Konigsberg fell to the Soviet army. Tens of thousands of surrendered German soldiers were marched off as prisoners, and the remaining civilians, the ones who had been unable to escape across the ice to evacuation ships at the port of Pillau, became subject to the Soviet occupation. This occupation was often harsh and brutal for the Germans there, and assaults, killings, and rape were a frequent occurrence. Of the pre-war population of about 370,000 people, by the end of the war only about 110,000 people remained, mostly ethnic Germans. Soviet policy in the early days was to engage with the local population. For example, the local newspaper, Novaya Vremya, was published in German, and when schools were reopened, they were also taught in German. This made sense as the population was overwhelmingly German. Even in October of 1945, there were only about 5,000 Soviet civilians in the city, in addition to some Red Army administrators, as well as some half-mobilized troops that had been left behind. It remained like this for almost a year and a half, when a decision was made to expel the German population from this city. In 1947, the majority of Germans were forced to leave. The decision was made for both financial reasons as well as a public health and safety precaution. As most of the Germans in Kaliningrad had no real source of income or support, they were getting by through the minimal help of Soviet citizens in the city, or were subsisting by eating dead animals. The Soviet administration, wanting to protect the incoming Soviet citizenry from potential diseases carried by the Germans, as well as relieve themselves of the burden of even minimally feeding them, decided that the best place for the Germans was somewhere else. They were sent westwards, the Soviet occupation zone in eastern Germany. And the rules on deportation were quite strict. They were only allowed to take 300 kilos of property per family with them, and even Germans from mixed families were not allowed to remain. It was not unheard of at the time for some Germans who did not want to leave to arrange for fake Lithuanian ID cards so they could remain in their homes and with their families. But, and there's always a but, not all Germans were expelled. There was a small group of German specialists that remained in the territory who were involved in the rebuilding of industrial capacity there. The group of several thousand people, labeled bourgeois specialists, were deemed indispensable and weren't allowed to leave. They had jobs in such critical fields as mining engineering, which the Soviets lacked but required. In fact, The demand for these German specialists was so great that both the civilian and military authorities would compete for individuals, trying to steal them away from each other. The competition got to the point that senior authorities had to implement punitive measures to prevent workers from being transferred. Of course, this demand for the specialist jobs waned over time as reconstruction jobs were completed and Soviet talent was trained and brought into the workforce. As a result, the German specialists, so recently considered indispensable, were all deported from Kaliningrad by the early 1950s. Despite their work and residency there, they were not given Soviet citizenship and were sent to East Germany. So at this point, it would seem that the newly renamed city had been emptied of its population, like some sort of Baltic version of 1975 Phnom Penh. But that isn't actually what happened. As the German population was being expelled, it was replaced by Soviet citizens being relocated to the new territory. They were brought in to work the land and to rebuild and work in the factories of the region. The majority of these new settlers to the area were ethnic Russians, coming from primarily Central Russia, but also some from Belarus and Ukraine. The first groups brought in were those in the labor camps already present in East Prussia. They were then followed by demobilized servicemen, largely those already stationed in the area, of which there were many as Kaliningrad was now the Soviet frontier. The third group of settlers to come in, finally, were volunteers, people looking for opportunity in a new place. Of course, included among those who volunteered were those people who were voluntold, essentially forced to leave where they were on local Communist Party instructions. Of course, we do need to keep in mind that these new residents were actually provided with some incentives to relocate. Depending on when they came and where they settled, they were granted tax breaks, a free cow, free housing, and even allowed to bring plenty of grain to start new farms. They were also given the much coveted internal passport, allowing them to travel and move about the country. For those who were trapped on the kolkhoz, this may have been enough to convince them to relocate. The evidence behind this lies with the fact that many settlers to the region immediately left the farms they were to work on to either move to the cities in search of better work or simply move back to their original homes, but with their passports in hand. A quick word on those citizens who were voluntold to move to the new region. Because relocation wasn't always popular, collective farms across the Soviet Union were given quotas of people to be sent, and the quota had to be met. So the farm boards used this as an opportunity to get rid of the less useful, shall we say, farm members. This included pregnant women, alcoholics, and the less educated, for example. By 1948, approximately 400,000 people had relocated to Kaliningrad Oblast. They came on the back of promises made, sometimes arriving hungry and without even basic items like shoes, and they were greeted with, well, ruin. The region had been devastated during the war and lacked adequate housing. Even for the post-war Soviet Union, the lack of housing was notable. In addition, basic utilities were often absent, including electricity, water, and heat. And Kaliningrad wasn't high on the priority list for the central government either. The 1946 Soviet budget didn't include the region, and it wasn't included in the first post-war 5-year plan. It was only accounted for by a special line item, so not really an important item in the minds of the leadership. But despite this, over time, the oblast slowly began to rebuild, largely on the back of a growing fishing industry. Additionally, Kaliningrad became the headquarters of the Soviet Baltic fleet, taking advantage of that ice-free port. The province remained a part of the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic, although Khrushchev offered in the 1950s to reassign it to the Lithuanian SSR. This was rejected, as the Lithuanians were reluctant to bring in so many ethnic Russians into their republic. With the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, Kaliningrad retained its status as a part of the new Russian Federation and remains a strategic exclave in the west and outpost for Moscow on the Baltic. The oblast does still have deep historical ties to its neighbors, with some ethnic Germans choosing to relocate back to the region, but it remains intrinsically tied to Russia. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and to make sure you don't miss all of our future episodes, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have promised the bell button a free cow and tax breaks before you press it. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com, and we're active on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. If you enjoy our work, your financial support would be greatly appreciated via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. This is The Cold War Channel, and don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it becomes heated.